session of the Sydney Neonatal Lectures, although this time it's completely chaired and presented by Newcastle in New South Wales. It's a pleasure to introduce Justine Parsons. She's our clinical nurse consultant here and a nurse educator for a long time with many different topics and ideas and support. But today she's going to talk about sustainability in the NICU. And I, for one, am very curious to hear what that contains and what that means and what we can do with it. Justine, over to you.
Thanks, Kurt. Okay, sustainability in NICU. Let's start. Okay, so these are the things that I'll cover. We'll talk about what the problem is, what the
recording in progress,
what the opportunities might be, where things are at currently, whether there are things we can do, some of our successes here at John Hunter Children's Hospital, and a little bit about plastics and PVC before we think about how do we move forward from there. Okay, so what's the problem? Climate change is the problem. It's a health emergency. With climate change and the warming of our globe, we will see increasing weather events, which will bring changes in infectious disease patterns. We will have problems with food and water security, all of those things which will knock on to create health emergencies and changes to our health service. So the WHO declared it the greatest single threat to global health in the 21st century. And this is because it will place unprecedented pressure on our health system with increased demand for healthcare. And it is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, infectious disease, and of course, heat stress. And it's important that we think about who the vulnerable populations are and those that are most at risk. And inevitably, they will be women and children, and they'll certainly be those of a poorer socioeconomic background and those who will be displaced and will have insecure housing and insecure food as well. So it's significant. In 2023, this is important to know because this was just published not long ago. The Earth's global mean temperature was the highest recorded since 1850. And it is already almost 1 degree higher than the previous decade. So preceding that, so since 1910, the overall temperature rise of the globe is close to 1.5 degrees. So it's already warming. It's already becoming an issue. And healthcare. So how does healthcare contribute to the climate crisis? So when you look at the Australian system and we have a look at what is the carbon footprint within health and the health sector, because we know that 7% of all of the carbon footprint in Australia belongs to healthcare. So of that, who is contributing the most? So public hospitals are contributing the most. There's more of them. Private hospitals have an impact. Probably second in line is pharmaceuticals, and that is not something that I'm going to cover today and would probably be a whole discussion in itself. So watch this space. We might talk about that at a later date. Capital expenditure and a bit from specialist medical services, a little bit from community and general practice, and very small amounts from other areas of health. So we have a large footprint within public hospitals. And when we're thinking about maternal and infant health and its relationship to climate change, when you consider overall, so if we start here on this particular graph that is out of Scandinavia 2021, climate change and the extreme weather events that become part of that. So there'll be increase in temperature, poor tornadoes, hurricanes, that kind of stuff, freak storms and wildfires that all come as part of that. So those things inevitably on their own will disrupt health services in the areas where that is occurring. which has an overall knock-on effect to maternal and newborn health, but it also has a direct effect on maternal and newborn health through the direct physical effects of those particular extreme weather events and the warming. It has a mental health perspective, so stress, anxiety, and depression, because I guess this is where you start to have problems with displacement of housing, greater rise in infectious diseases, food insecurity, those kind of things. So that all adds to the state of maternal and newborn health. And of course, down here, we've got the social, economic and cultural context of that, and a lot of that, which is related to failed crops and the general malnutrition that will come from that kind of a problem. So when you get knuckled down a little bit further and you start to look around for what does the research say with regards to NICU or with regards to neonatal health, and there's a little bit of research, but not a great deal. The last couple of years, we're starting to see a little bit more come out of that space, but 2022 and 2023, there are a little bit more with regards to research and neonatal or maternal health. One of the papers that came out was from China, and it was about a interesting a scenario that they saw, which was where women in a particular area of China that had, I think, a heat wave that persisted for 2 weeks. And they were able to measure the effect on the pregnant women, so pre and post this particular event. And certainly there was a significant amount of heat stress on those pregnant women, which led to a whole lot of other knock-on effects. So the women will have a physiological response to that heat. That can lead to dehydration. You can have changes in blood flow, and which affects the circulation to placenta, all kinds of things, which then can lead to fetal distress and sometimes stillbirth. Another couple of papers that have come out of the US, and this was particularly around California and Oregon, and this was after they had significant wildfire disasters. And this directly affected their hospitals, and some of these papers were looking at basically not how do we prevent climate change or how do we change our healthcare to adapt to it, but it was about how basically do you safely evacuate a NICU, because that has had to happen a number of times. And to decant an entire level 6 hospital of the NICU patients was, tricky. And they learned a lot of things when they were trying to decide on how best to decant and evacuate a NICU safely. And they came to the conclusion that we're all very unprepared for this kind of thing, and that there will be a significant need for live drills. Another study looked at the impact of the wildfire smoke on pregnant women and what kind of outcomes that had. So there is emerging research, but not huge amounts in the neonatal space. So this is from Climate Central, which is the coastal risk screening tool. And I've popped Newcastle on here, but anybody can look this up at Climate Central and choose your this particular chart, which is comparison of long-term sea level outcomes. So what you can see here, this is Newcastle over here, and you can see that in the light blue, sort of the aqua colour here, that is the sea level rise at 1 degree of global warming. And this is looking at, into the future. So 1 degree of global warming would see a sea level rise in these areas, which are obviously the low-lying areas of Newcastle. The pink that you start to see, those pink pieces, is if the climate warms to 1.5 degrees, and where you could expect sea level rises to start affecting from there. So lots of people, and interestingly, lots of people who live along the beach, could expect potentially for there to be some sea level rise if the rate of climate warming continues the way that it is. And of course, if you want to look at the worst case scenario, which is, so again, the aqua is at 1 degree, and the pink now, we've changed the sliding scale to 4 degrees. So, which is effectively the trajectory that the world is facing if we continue to do only as much as we're doing now. So this becomes then a whole lot of Newcastle is suddenly underwater. I find that when I'm talking to nursing staff about the climate emergency, it's graphs and pictures like this that start to make it feel a little bit more real, because this is where we live. This is what will happen to areas that we are living in. So this all sounds like doom and gloom, and it is kind of, but there are opportunities involved in this. So while the climate change poses the largest threat to global health, it also is providing one of the greatest opportunities that is there for science and technology and change to occur. So there's a whole range of things that are educational, that you can look up and self-educate. And I think that's important. We need to educate ourselves. So there are healthy environment podcasts for nurses. There's courses, short courses you can do in environmental health. There are a bunch of groups that you can join that help us become more educated and more activated, potentially. So the AMA have Doctors for the Environment group, and there are another group called Climate Action Nurses, which are all great organisations that are starting to bring the focus back to what do we do. And of course, there are tools around that you can use as well, and toolkits. And this particular upside down triangle is talking about how do you change behaviours within health. So looking at the things we purchase that perhaps we don't need to, looking at things that we should be reusing, things that can be reprocessed, and looking then into things like composting waste, recycling waste, using waste to energy, and of course your last option should be placing that waste into landfill. So there's a lot of information around, and I think the first place is to get educated first of all, so that you know what you're talking about, and from there get active, join groups, and then consider how behaviours can be changed in your workplace. So there are opportunities with regards to this problem. These are the targets set by New South Wales government, and you can see that in comparison to some of the other states. So over here we've got New South Wales hopes to have a 50% reduction based on the 2005 figures by 2030. So this is how that looks on a graph, and how long it would take then to reach net zero. So with that reduction of 50% by 2030, it would still take us to 2050 to be able to effectively reach net zero. Queensland has a slightly lower figure, a lower target that they're following. Victoria initially had a target of 28 to 33%, but have since increased that to 45 to 50, and hopefully by 2030 as well. South Australia have the same target as New South Wales, and they will reach net zero at roughly the same time. And Tasmania, interestingly, are already effectively net zero, which is interesting. They achieved that in 2015. WA doesn't have a target at this point. ACT have a 50 to 60% target, which they had set to reach by 2025, and then they intend to reach 90 to 95 by 2040, and in that case they will reach net zero a whole lot sooner, and Northern Territory are yet to join the party. Hunter New England, which is the local health district that we reside in, wants to be carbon and waste neutral by 2030. So that is zero contribution of general waste to landfill by 2030, which is very optimistic. So where are we at currently? So currently Are we on target? No, not at all. So we can see here that from 1990 what the emissions trends have been. And so they've been on the rise since about 1995, peaking at 2005 levels here. And if we look at where we are now, which is roughly here, you can see that the 2017 projection was the blue line here, and the 2018 projection, which was only slightly better, was a bit lower. But what we need, the trajectory we need to be on, is this dotted line here. So if we want to get to a trajectory to -5% by 2020, it was more like this kind of a line. And if you want to get to -26% by 2030, we need to be increasing our efforts, and the same for a -28% target. So no, we are not on target at all. So there's also the climate action tracker. If you ever get interested about what countries are doing what and what are the how well are they doing, and compare yourself to them. And as of August 2022, I haven't checked lately, but I believe it's not any different at the moment. Our overall rating for Australia is insufficient. So that means what we are doing to work towards a net zero target by 2050 is poor. So we're not doing enough. Then you can look at other things, so such as policies in action, whether or not we have the right or enough policies, whether we are using the right targets, and whether there is any climate finance. And you'll notice over here that that's critically insufficient, because there's not a great deal around with regards to government resources that are being pushed into that industry. So as I said, the carbon footprint of the healthcare sector is 7% of the entire total of Australia's carbon footprint. So that basically is the same as the carbon emissions of all activities of South Australia. So healthcare is basically providing the carbon footprint of one entire state of Australia. So it's a lot. Globally, so we're a little bit worse off than the rest of the world. Carbon footprint elsewhere globally is roughly closer to 5% of the carbon footprint from healthcare. So we're a little bit worse than other countries. So I can hear you asking, what's NICU's carbon footprint? Well, we don't know, because nobody's ever measured it. What we can do is perhaps extrapolate some of the information from other intensive care units that possibly we can take some information from. But what we do know is that critical care services use a lot of resources. They use huge amounts of energy. They use a real lot of pharmaceuticals, and they use a lot of single-use consumables. So it's already been noted that an ICU of any sort is a carbon hotspot, and will use 3 times as much as 3 times as large a carbon footprint than a general ward. So you can see from the graph over here is a general ward or low intensity unit, and this is in the US and the UK, so comparing them across the board. So some of them use slightly less energy than others, but essentially the split is fairly similar. When you get to intensive care or high intensity care in the US and the UK, you can see that the energy use goes up incredibly. You can see that water also goes up, certainly in the US it does. Waste is about static. And then you get into other things like equipment, food, and staff travel, how far staff travel around and things. So basically it's energy and water use that are our biggest problem, along with consumables. So in our own NICU, we measured some things to see roughly what we were using, because it's better to start small and kind of get a picture from what you are looking at in your own NICUs. So with us, we decided that we would begin, and we formed a little sustainability action group where we elected to look at what we were using with regards to single-use feeding bottles. And we were shocked to discover that we were using between 90 and 100,000 of these per year. So what that meant was, at the time, 90 to 100,000 bottles every year were going into landfill at that time. We didn't have any recycling streams at the time. And some other things that we've measured. So we looked at nappies and how many nappies a year we were using. So that's a bit more than the bottles, so 105,000 of those annually. We were using 156,000 feeding syringes per year, and dressing packs, which was just a side issue. I was just curious to see how many of those we were using. And we're using almost 12,500 dressing packs just in NICU. And of course, the things that we haven't measured is basically everything else. So I guess we've only started and scratched the surface here in our own NICU. So what can we do? There's lots we can do. There really is. You just have to get started. So one of the things that I found most helpful is some toolkits that are around, and there are more and more of them as time goes along. And one of them is this Beginner's Guide to Sustainability in the ICU. So you can take some information from there and extrapolate it for use in the NICU. But I think what we do is we need to have more of this philosophy of the triangle, and we need to look at what is most preferred in the way that we work and what is least preferred. So wherever we can, we should be preventing using more than we need, or having preventative healthcare so that patients don't have to be admitted and use a whole lot of resources thereafter. So primary healthcare is one of the things that feeds into prevention. We should reuse things as much as we can. So if that's thinking about, the one that comes to mind that is incredible is surgical gowns or sterile gowns for procedures. So years ago, they were always material and reprocessed, re-sterilised and returned for use. And now they're all disposable single-use items, which is all going into landfill. Your next option, if you can't reuse things, is to work out what you can do with those products. So it might be recycling, and that's great. That's fantastic. And if it can't be entirely recycled, there may be components of those products that could be recovered potentially. And of course, the very last resort should be disposal, and that inevitably is disposal into landfill or it's incinerated, etc. And of course, that's our least preferred option. So considering the way that we work in NICU and elsewhere in healthcare with this philosophy, and considering every product we bring in to the NICU or every practice we establish in NICU should kind of have these things as a philosophy in the background, ideally. This is, I guess, part of that is carefully considering lots of things that we're not used to considering, really. And this is how items are manufactured. So what are the raw materials that are used in that product? What's the process for manufacturing that product? How much energy does that manufacturing process use? What kind of packaging do things come in? Can that be reduced? And how does it get here? And from how far? Because, some things that you could buy potentially locally, but you get a better price potentially, but it comes from the other side of the world. Actually, is that, are we just transferring costs to elsewhere in the system? Of course, you have to consider how you use it, whether it can be washed, dried, what kind of maintenance it uses, because all of those things require energy. And of course, how you are going to dispose of those products when you're finished. And I don't think healthcare has been particularly good at considering those things. We tend to look at the product, the use of it for our patients, and then we don't give a hell of a lot of consideration to what it's made of, where it's come from, how we're going to use it, and then how do we get rid of it when we're done. So, but there are things that you can do. There are other projects around. There's things at different LHD levels that are places that are doing, really well, and then there are others that are doing not so well. So at an LHD level, you can contain the demand for healthcare, and that is about looking at your primary health, looking at your preventative strategies to keep people out of hospital. Another thing that has a much lower carbon emission is home-based healthcare. So having patients at home as soon as is practically possible, using much more telehealth, and also reducing your low-value care. So really considering, say, different tests and things that you're using, and how critical that is to the patient care. Telehealth, we got suddenly very good at that through COVID, and it's probably slightly dropped off since then, but it's been interesting that that has been something that forced us into adopting that strategy. Certainly building design. There are lots of things that can go into building design to make those buildings much more energy efficient, much more green in design, and being more in touch with the natural environment, which makes people feel better about being in hospital. There are lots of things you can do with water saving, and there's some great examples, even in our own district, of the water that is used through the dialysis process, and how they've been able to capture that and divert it into being grey water for gardens and toilets and those sorts of things. There's also capacity for you to capture more water from buildings and use it in grounds and in sewage and that sort of stuff. So there's ways of doing that. Power saving. There are some hospitals that are very, very good at this, who have either installed solar energy, and certainly our hospital, it turns out, has the largest solar energy installation of any hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. So that's great, but it still only is providing about something like 40% of our overall energy that we use. So we're doing better, but there's probably still room to move. Powering down your equipment after in between use and overnight. Rooms that don't get used a hell of a lot, that just have lights that turn on when you go into them, if they're not frequently used. And then considering battery storage for power for hospitals, that takes some pressure off as well. Not so much for NICU related eco-friendly options, but certainly there's a lot of food waste in hospitals, and that's generally because patients don't get to select their meals. They're just being given a set amount of food of set type, and if they don't eat that, it goes straight to the bin. And I think that's a bit of a tragedy, given that the amount of waste that we're talking about, and most hospitals are not composting food waste or anything like that. So hospitals that have been able to allow patients to choose what they would like and how much of that have reduced their food waste significantly. So at the healthcare worker level, things that we can do is really look for opportunities to reduce our single-use item in our different aspects of care. We should preference locally derived consumables wherever possible. You can say no to extra packaging, and that's, for example, with our nappy supplier. So we use compostable nappies here in NICU John Hunter, and we asked for those to be delivered in very large quantities so that we reduce the size of the boxes that they came in, and we also asked them to not be wrapped in extra layers of plastic when they're delivered. So sometimes you can negotiate with companies that you're working with. You can also look for the way that we're working and the behaviours, the sort of work patterns that we've always followed, and what kind of opportunities are in there to change it and maybe make it more efficient. There's lots of opportunities. You could look around in health, and there are bazillion opportunities to make work patterns much more efficient and a little bit more waste neutral. Of course, you've got to encourage your colleagues. You spend a lot of time at the healthcare worker level encouraging your colleagues to use waste correctly, to separate their waste properly, to make the effort to take their paper to the paper and recycling bin and all those kinds of things, and also just remind people of what this means and the reason why we're changing these behaviours. So waste streams is really interesting because if we were to say that general waste costs $1 to dispose of. Paper recycling costs about half that, a third to half of that. Clinical waste, which is contaminated waste, for want of a better term. So these are the things that, that should be free-flowing body fluids, those kind of things that are a contaminated waste. That is a very expensive waste product to dispose of. So for general waste costs $1, it would cost almost $4 to get rid of, and sharps are the worst. So sharps cost over $4.50. So to dispose of sharps, they have to be decontaminated first, then they are crushed, and then they are incinerated. So all of that. So when you look in your sharps bins, just check how much of that is actually sharp. So this is one of ours. And you can see that this particular sharps bin is full of stuff that is not actually sharp. So we've got some bits of lines, we've got gloves, we've got prep pads, we've got packaging, all kinds of stuff. And I think that's just generally because health staff, it's easier to just chuck it there in front of them rather than separate it out to where it actually needs to go. However, if we get better with our waste, it frees up more resource and money for other things that we need in healthcare. And I think we can all recognise that healthcare is a bit lean with regards to resources lately. So some of the successes we've had here in our unit. So one of them is the bottles. So as I spoke about, we looked around for a recycling stream that would collect the plastic. We had to analyse what plastic was of the bottles that we were using, and it's a number 5 plastic, which is extremely recyclable. And we then started to separate them and prepare them for recycling process. So the nursing staff and the parents, I guess at some points, will rinse those bottles and place them into a receptacle, which then goes down and is collected into a bulk waste. We've been able to add new plastics to that. So, for example, your water for injection or water for irrigation bottles and a bunch of other things, pieces of the expressing equipment, all kinds of stuff that we have been able to join into that same stream. And we've had other people join us. So the postnatal ward said, oh my God, you're recycling bottles. That's great. Can we bring ours up to you as well? And they do. And that's been great. And we're trying desperately to roll it out to the paediatric unit as well, who use less bottles, but nevertheless do use some. And it would be really helpful for them to join. A lot of people will say, yeah, but, recycled plastic, don't you have to, manufacturing things, doesn't it use a whole lot of energy to turn it into a new product? And the fact is that manufacture of recycled plastic uses about 75% less energy than virgin or primary plastics. So it's worth doing. And there are end markets for this plastic, and actually hospital grade plastic is highly sought after by some of these recyclers. Nappies, we've not all of our nappy sizes have been able to be compostable nappies, but we managed to, out of the 105,000, we've managed to get 85,000 of them swapped over to a compostable product. And we've even been able to get those into a compostable bin liner now, so that when they do go to landfill, they will break down quicker. Now, ideally, we would have a composting facility where we'd be able to put all of these in and compost them properly. But until we have that, this is at least a step in the right direction, where compostable nappies in the landfill, in compostable bin liners, will break down quicker than the 100 years that non-compostable nappies take to break down in landfill. Some other good news stories and things we've been able to do here is equipment repurposing. So we had 7 Draeger isolate incubators that biomedical engineering came up and said, what do you want us to do with these? And I said, what would you normally do with them? And they said, well, we'll just, we take them to the dump pretty much when they're finished with, when they're not being serviced anymore, those sorts of things. So I couldn't believe that. I was utterly aghast. And anyway, so I thought, okay, we'll find some homes for these. So approached a whole lot of different facilities, and one of which was the Port Stephens Koala Hospital, and who lovingly took 2 of our Dragar isolates, and here's one in use here, and you can see this blue box that's inside the incubator that actually contains this possum. And it made me laugh because I thought, I guess you can't just leave a possum inside an incubator without a basket for it to be in, or it'll just run around the incubator. Never really thought about it. Anyway, so they have been extremely grateful for that, and they've had them almost in constant use since they were delivered to them. We gave one to Wires, and this is a bird rescued from an oil spill. Turns out they get very hypothermic, and here's this heron hanging around in one of our Dragar isolates. The rest of them, we had a whole lot more of 13 omnibeds, and we had 24 Fisher and Paykel resuscitators that are being, and this is in the process, that are being replaced at the end of their life. And we have been able to partner with a company called MediShare, and they have donated funds that they pack all of this stuff into shipping containers, and most of our incubators went to Nigeria. So that's great. So this is 4.678 tonnes of equipment that we've managed to keep out of landfill and benefit other organisations. Now, the problem with plastic. So I need to talk to you about this because PVC is everywhere. So PVC, polyvinyl chloride, what is it? It's one of 6 commonly used plastics. Half of its weight is chlorine. It's cheap. It's really cheap. Companies love it. It's so cheap, it's durable, and it hangs around forever. So you can it's very hard to kill. It's light and it's versatile, and so many industries use it. When it's made virgin, it's white in colour and it's quite stiff. So inevitably what happens is you have to add a whole lot of plasticizers to make it flexible. And in its original form, it's quite resistant to corrosion and impact, water and chemicals, which makes it a great product, but also makes it hard to dispose of. So it can be used in rigid form. So things like the dashboards of cars and things like that. So it's rigid. But for hospital use and lots of other use, it's used after plasticizers have been added. So that makes our tubes and cables and IV lines and feeding tubes, all kinds of things that have the plasticizer added. So you're probably thinking, well, that sounds okay. What do we know about polyvinyl chloride? And it's interesting. So when you Google it, PVC, the first things that come up are this. PVC remains material of choice for life-saving devices. Sounds great. Learn about the importance of PVC in healthcare settings. So we're talking about PVC flooring and floor coverings and furniture, and how it helps prevent the spread of disease and infection due to its excellent surface properties and cleanability. Note the website that this comes from, the Vinyl Info website, same as Plastics Today up here. And there's more. It lasts for up to 20 years of intensive use, and it's a natural choice for hospitals. And the Vinyl Council of Australia says it's revolutionised PVC, or PVC has revolutionised delivery of healthcare since the 60s, and it's amazing and it plays a pivotal role. So you'd go, okay, sounds great. Now, these websites, they pay good money to have these statements come up and their websites preferenced on Google. So sounds great, nothing to worry about, all good. Okay, so you go a little bit further and you go, okay, I'm probably not going to take the word of Plastics Today and the Vinyl Council of Australia on this. I might look a bit further. So look a little bit further and you can go to Healthcare Without Harm Europe and what they say about PVC. So PVC poses serious risks to our health and the environment during production, use and disposal. Canada, PVC and phthalates acknowledging that it's harmful to patients, the environment, and public health. How this common material is harming the environment, and is PVC toxic, and what's coming out of it, chemical pollutants, dioxins, etc. So there's plenty to worry about with PVC, and it is everywhere. So from an environmental perspective, just looking at PVC, it's one of the most environmentally damaging plastics that there is, and is one of the most toxic substances for the inhabitants of our planet. From cradle to grave, PVC life cycle, so production, use and disposal, there's a hell of a lot of toxic fluorine-based chemicals, and it's one of the world's largest dioxin sources, all of which contributes to warming the environment. So production of this uses coal-generated power, inevitably, and a lot of it comes from China. It's extremely resistant to degradation, so that's incredibly difficult then to dispose of. The phthalates that are combating the brittleness of the PVC, these leak out of the product into soil, waterways, air, and actually people, but we'll get to that in a minute. And PVC microplastic waste products enter the food chain. So that this is already known about, that it is basically, you know, I think if we looked at the cellular level, we would all find that we've got a hell of a lot of PVC floating around in our systems, and certainly plastics have been already found within placentas. Affects the nutritional qualities of the food, because of this is all in the soil and the water that we are growing our food in. The food ends up being smaller in size and weight, and the vitamin depletion can be significant. You can recycle it, and a lot of people will tell you, oh yeah, but you can recycle it. Well, you can, but it's really expensive and it's complicated, and it risks generally releasing dioxins, and only about 1% of the global PVC is actually recycled anyway. But what about for healthcare? What is it doing to us for healthcare? So what we can tell you is that there is no safe level of PVC exposure. It is the biggest source of microplastic. It has to have these plasticizers in it, and they use a whole range of different phthalates, and those phthalates then leach into the patient. They already know that they're identified as endocrine disruptors. They tend to interact with estrogen receptors, and they bind with them, and they kind of mimic estrogen actions. And phthalates have been associated with lymphoma, leukemia, cancers, brain, liver, and lungs generally. There's a whole lot of ways that PVC and phthalates get into the patient. But in our area of the world, so if we looked at maternal exposure, so during the pregnancy of PVC, exposure for pregnant women is associated with neural tube defects, skeletal malformation, cardiovascular malformation, liver effects, developmental delay, autism, all kinds of stuff, and of course, intrauterine death. There was a study out of the Netherlands and the USA that demonstrated that children whose mothers had a high exposure to phthalates during the pregnancy had a lower grey matter volume at age 10 and a bit of a lower IQ at age 14 when they were followed up. So antenatal exposure to phthalates and PVC is a problem. So once the baby is born and comes into our NICU following a preterm birth, interestingly, phthalates and PVC have this weird cardiovascular effect. And there's this great study that came out in 2021, which was incredible. So it looked at very low birth weight infants over a 7-year period. And this was, what they did was looked at what their rate of hypertension was preceding. So their baseline rate in that particular unit was 7.7%. And then what happened was all of their IV lines, they had a supply problem, and they ended up having to go for a more expensive but PVC-free product. And during that period of time, the average rate fell to 1.4% of their very low birth weight patients with hypertension. And then, of course, once the general product that they had used was back on the market, of course, it's cheaper, so the hospital switched back. And then the baseline rate of hypertension returned to a higher level. So it's sort of one of those accidental studies that they were able to demonstrate that using PVC is affecting rates of very low birth weight babies and hypertension. So where is PVC in healthcare in NICU? It's absolutely and utterly everywhere. So NICU products contain lots of phthalates, so incubators, IV tubing, IV cannulas, blood bags, oxygen tubing, CPAP, ET tubes, suction catheters, ventilator circuits, resus masks, feeding tubes, and on and on and on. Basically, almost everything that's in this picture will contain some PVC and subsequently phthalates. The longer that a baby remains in the NICU, so the more preterm the baby is, of course, the higher exposure to the phthalates that they will receive. Preterm babies will have less ability to metabolize those contaminants, so they're much more sensitive to endocrine disruption, which means that our most vulnerable to the effects are the most exposed populations. And they think that there are critical windows where that effect is amplified. So there was a study in 2022 of 360 preterm infants that showed exposure between 26 and 30 weeks gestation was associated with a diagnosis of BPD at 36 weeks. Oh, I think someone's not on mute. This is just interesting for your for all the people who drink bottled water. There are more PVC polymers in bottled water than tap water, obviously. And if you drank 1 litre per day of plastic bottled water, you'll get 90,000 microparticles per year of PVC. And if you drink a litre of tap water, you'll only get 4,000 microparticles per year. So rethink using plastic water bottles. So the way forward, what can we do? Well, in our NICU, we plan to try to measure PVC use. It's really hard to do because it's literally everywhere, and it's hard to get companies to tell you what kind of phthalates are in their products. What you'll find is there's a particular phthalate called DEHP, and that was the one that everybody was really worried about initially. So companies got rid of it. But what they did was substitute it with another phthalate, which we probably know even less about, and does not stop the leaching of those phthalates into patients anyway. So really what we need to look for is PVC-free products, not just DEHP-free products, which a lot of companies will try to tell you is perfectly fine. But you won't know how much you've got unless you measure it. So you need to measure it. Maybe create an inventory of all your products and then start looking around for alternatives if there are, because there are some available resources. There is stuff out there, and preference the companies that are moving towards PVC alternatives and preferentially support them if you can. Of course, we need to educate ourselves at the very beginning, be aware of the science, but do be aware of the propaganda. There is so much propaganda out there. And there are, for example, this particular vinylverified.com. These are the sort of posters that they often drop off to make you feel a whole lot better about using PVC in healthcare and how amazing it's been all of this time. This is another one that they've put out. PVC sterile tubing helps administer basic care, and on it goes. So watch out for the propaganda. There is a push for PVC recycling in hospitals, and it is not recommended because for the reasons that I mentioned before, it's very expensive to recycle and it releases a whole lot of stuff. So some companies, one of which we won't mention by name, offer this recycling, but we think that they actually collect it and ship it offshore to elsewhere for disposal by other, perhaps poorer nations. So given the scale of this plastics market and the money that there is to be made, it really probably needs government legislation. So overseas, PVC in hospitals has been banned in a number of countries. So Sweden, a whole lot of districts of Canada have already moved towards being PVC free, parts of Italy. And interestingly, in Australia, you can't have PVC in products for infants and children, so rattles, toys, dummies, those sorts of things. But healthcare has an exemption. So we give it to them anyway if they're in hospital. So final thoughts. global warming will affect our patient population. That's without a doubt. We can reduce our carbon footprint and make a difference. You just have to begin. PVC is an environmental problem, but also a healthcare problem. Our NICU patient population is the most at risk of that. There are alternatives, there are resources, but you need to push the market and potentially, hopefully, some of those activist groups will be able to, give pressure to governments for PVC bans and things for healthcare. Thank you. I think that's enough.
Oh, thanks, Justine. That was a great overview about sustainability, but you went a little bit deeper. You also highlighted some of the dangers of very specific materials which we use very commonly, and how either producers and people who sort of offer this to us try to sort of inform us about these kind of details where it's hard to find good evidence, as one of the studies you presented. I really appreciate the fact that we most of the time think this is too far from our beds, but I know there are audiences here which live in places where it is actually very close to becoming a really real problem. And you highlighted how we can then use this not only in our daily life, but maybe also in the hospital. So there's some questions in the chat box, and I'll start just from the top about particularly disposing things, because that was great, that picture of these sharp box. But disposing of IV fluid bags, we are asked not to put the fluid down our sinks. What is the pros and the cons?
Yeah, so with IV fluid bags, yes. I guess what you need to think about is where that fluid is going, and we are the same. We don't put it down our sinks either, but we do have a sluice in the back room, and so all of our IV bags go out to there, and our cleaning staff will empty those down the sluice before they are collected. So some of them that are non-PVC, we will collect and recycle, and the others, unfortunately, do go into landfill. So it's complicated. And of course, in hospitals, it's never straightforward. There's always 10 steps you have to take.
Well, yeah, the next question by Karen is about on that similar sort of jest that, we get asked to use the cheapest of products. And I guess the cheapest of products in general are also not the cleanest or the greenest. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that is a massive problem. It doesn't matter how much benefit for the environment or benefit even for the patient that you can demonstrate. If it's not cost effective, they're not interested. And you can have a lot of barriers at procurement level. However, lots of groups have been doing a whole lot of lobbying to New South Wales Government and New South Wales Health procurement arm to say this needs to be a consideration before you select products to go onto your approved tender list. And I think that's going to get better, so that we will have to take it more into account, what its eco credentials are before we choose a product. And hopefully that will start to swing a little bit, so that it won't be always about the cheapest. It also has to meet some other criteria for eco-friendliness, so to speak.
I can imagine the balances for everybody who is involved in buying something, but just for ourselves, what can we do just on the floor?
One thing I always say to the nurses on the floor is only gather consumables and products that you need. Like, don't over supply at the bedside, because inevitably whatever you've taken to the bedside can't be reused by anywhere else. So even if you don't use it, it will be disposed of into landfill, and that's terrible. So only take what you absolutely need. So take less and reduce your use. That's probably the first place to start, and get your waste segregation in order. So put the right waste in the right stream.
Yeah. So does it apply to metal? Do we do metal recycling as well?
We do metal recycling here. So our once only scissors, which is, still makes me absolutely horrified, that you can use a pair of scissors for one use and then literally throw them into landfill, because that's cheaper than re-sterilising them. So we do collect those, and we have a metal recycling collection, and we are in partnership with theatres and adult ICU, and we all put our pooled metals together, and then we send them to the recycler. So we do that.
So, and then, because this is Christy's sort of question on it, where is the recycler?
Yeah, the problem is you are kind of limited by who will collect from your hospital, which recyclers are interested in your products. So there has to be a market at the other end, or no one will pick it up. So you have to do a lot of work to source out who is interested in the products you've got. And it's not standard anywhere.
Yeah, look, this is for the audience. So every now and then, Justine walks with 2 bags of sort of, some sort of recycling material. And I'm assuming she's just taking them home and then pushes them in a special bin somewhere along the way. But that's just a thing.
That's
on
all
the side.
true.
A bit more serious. There's 2 questions here, which is related to the PVC. Sure, the companies will push for their products, but they might also have a benefit, particularly in infection reduction. What is your thoughts about that?
There are alternatives. So there are a whole lot of other products that don't create the environmental cost, but also the cost to patient health that are available. So for example, in our NICU, we have moved away from PVC feeding tubes over to polyurethane, and that don't leach any product into the patient and are a whole lot greener to produce. So just search for alternatives that still deliver the care that you want, but with less impact. And it takes work. You have to look for it.
Yeah, and I guess, depending on where you are residing,
Yes.
those producers might not always be available. So it is certainly something where we should start and continue on. I guess I went to all the questions. There's a lot of thank yous and for this overview and bringing these thoughts and ideas. I guess I have just, one question which we talked about just before we had this meeting. We do a lot of tests, particularly blood tests, where we don't do anything with the results. Is that sustainability if I stop doing those tests?
Absolutely. So there is a study that is around, whose name escapes me at the moment, but that measured the carbon footprint of every individual full blood count and what that costs the hospital, the environment, the patient, etc. And it's significant. So even reducing unnecessary tests is super important. It has an impact. And we can do much better. Same as looking at low value healthcare. So tests and studies and things that, if we're not going to get a great deal of information out of, do we really need to do them?
Yeah, that's an important food for thought. We have just 1 minute. How do we get started?
You just start. You get a group of like-minded people together and you start brainstorming how to begin. And if you're lucky, your hospital will have a sustainability department or a person who will help you. Otherwise, just start researching, and you can't do it by yourself. You do need a group of people. And even though I do carry home the garbage sometimes, mostly there's a team of us who do some of that stuff. So you need a team. So gather a team of like-minded individuals and start working out where to begin, one project at a time.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation today. It was a very unusual topic, but really giving some food for thought, as you saw in the pictures here. Thanks everybody for attending again. Next week, we have another session. We have Michelle Jackman, who's going to talk about general movement videos and their role currently in neonatal care and follow-up. So thank you all for attending. Hope to see you next week.
Recording stopped.